Damning and explicit text messages revealed during the David preliminary hearing today, allegedly proving the rising music star had a sexual relationship with 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. On top of the accusations that David killed Celeste, dismembered her body, and disposed of it. It's important to remember that he is also charged with sexual abuse of a child under 14. Police laid out alleged child sexual abuse material found on the singer's phone that could be damning if this case goes to trial. I will also tell you about the gruesome new details revealed today about how the teen may have died, which caused a gasp in the courtroom. We're on the case presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. All week, we have heard about moments in the courtroom that cause people to leave, to look away, to gasp. And there's no question that the images in a case like this are difficult to look at. But you have to wonder, based on how members of the media are reacting during a preliminary hearing, how might a jury react if they see what prosecutors have presented? David, however, has been, we're told, pretty stoic through it all. New images here for sketch artist Mona Edwards of the fourth day of this preliminary hearing in Los Angeles. Today, perhaps the most graphic, explicit, visual, and potentially damning evidence in this case against the rising music star. Joining us now once again, Julia Dang from NBC LA, a reporter who's in the courtroom for day 4 of this preliminary hearing. Julia, this afternoon, a lot of focus on text messages between David and Celeste. Walk us through what I know was a very emotional final part of the day here.
Chris, a lot of damning evidence today as it relates to not the murder charge, but another felony charge in this case against David Anthony Burke. It's the felony count of continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14. Of course, they're talking about the murder case, 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. So we've heard descriptions of this digital evidence before. We've seen this in charging documents. We've reported on this. Prosecutors have described photos they found in David's iCloud account on his devices. They've described text messages between the two of them referencing sexual activity and things like abortion, emergency contraception. Today in court, during day 4 of this preliminary hearing, we actually got to see and read some of those text messages. Now, we did not see any explicit photos because that, of course, is child sexual abuse material. We did hear from another LAPD detective who took the stand, Corey Farrell, and he was charged with looking at those photos on sheets of printer paper the prosecutor handed him, and then describing verbally for the court what he saw. And Chris, I got to tell you, there's been a lot of distressing, disturbing, graphic evidence in this case during the preliminary hearing. I think today might have actually been the toughest day for me. I can tell you it was a tough day for the victim's parents. Her mother, Mercedes, who sat through autopsy testimony, who sat through images showing her daughter's remains in the cadaver bags. She walked out of the courtroom during this testimony today. I could hear her holding back, racking sobs. The victim's father walked out behind her. So did their attorney, their wrongful death attorney, Patrick Steinfeld. And I think it's because this is actually the first time during the course of this preliminary hearing where Celeste is being presented as a living human, a young girl who is very much alive, a young girl who has a voice, who is expressing her feelings, her wants, her needs. Before this, she was a bag of decomposing body parts. She was an autopsy subject. She was a collection of limbs that had been severed from each other. But this afternoon, she became human again as we heard about these photos, um, and saw some images that, of course, were not child sexual abuse material that could be shown to the court. We saw Celeste at age 13 with what appeared to be a diamond engagement ring on her left ring finger. That's the finger that had David's name tattooed on it in red ink. We saw photos of the two of them kissing and cuddling in bed. We saw selfies of the two of them. Celeste with her red hair in the front seat of his Tesla. What prosecutors are doing right now, I think, is painting a picture of the nature of their relationship, just how much time they spent together, what they discussed, the future they talked about planning together. Here's what struck me. Here was my big takeaway walking out of the courtroom today. Previously, we heard the relationship characterized as maybe one sided, right? It sounded like Celeste, this teenager, was pushing for more, and she was jealous of David's relationships with other women. So the text messages that were read aloud and shown to us in court today actually flip that narrative. That surprised me. I was not expecting that during testimony today. But it sounds like David is actually the one who brought up moving in together, spending more time together, a wedding, again, to this child. She was 13 at the time many of these conversations were documented. Having kids. He states in a text message to Celeste's number that they want 2 kids. And this came out as well. We have previously heard references to abortion, and the Plan B morning after pill in their text message exchanges. But today we actually saw messages discussing an abortion appointment for Celeste in January of 2024. Now, do the math there. Her birthday was September of 2010. She was 13 when this purported abortion took place. Where we just wrapped court this afternoon, we were looking at text messages where Celeste is now expressing regret, telling David over text that she would do anything to take that back.
And that was to your point about it, just kind of today, you're hearing Celeste in her own words for the first time. And we knew that the relationship was intimate. We knew that the relationship had all these different elements to it that led to a charge of child sex abuse that he's facing. But to hear it in her own words and to kind of see the dynamic of the relationship, I think it just kind of brought things to a different level. I also was thinking, just looking at the timeline here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because January of 2024, they're talking about this abortion appointment. And then I keep going back to that body cam that you described from February of 2024 when she was missing. Police go to her house and he's almost acting as if like he doesn't really know who she is. He's eating some chips. He's very casual about it. And it just, for as much as there's this kind of now dynamic we understand of the relationship through the text messages, I think it makes that body cam video look way more damning and kind of shows just how much he was allegedly misleading police at that point in time and acting like he didn't really know who she was, when clearly these text messages show that this relationship was at a very serious level.
Absolutely, Chris. I think it also paints a great picture of just how convincing David can be as a liar. Because when that body cam recording was taken in February of 2024, that's also the time period where we saw text message conversations today in court showing that David and Celeste were talking about something called OA, Operation Awesome, where they were plotting her departure, her runaway from her home in Lake Elsinore. And this struck me too. David appears to be the one pushing this. He's the one who keeps on asking her, do you have your bags packed? He tells her, bring everything you're going to use that I can immediately replace. Bring a bigger bag. Do you have everything packed? Are you ready to go? In one of these messages from that particular exchange, he calls that her runaway date. And I believe it was the day before Valentine's Day in 2024. He calls it the most important day of her life, aside from their anticipated wedding. Again, at this time, she is only 13 years old. This is just a couple weeks after memorialized in these text messages, she apparently had an abortion. And the prosecutor made sure to have the LAPD detective presenting this evidence read messages from Celeste to David confirming that it is his child.
And just because I'm looking at the notes here that you sent over today, and this was right before court ended, kind of talking about the dynamic of this relationship, because it had been presented, at least to me at this point, that, this was so one-sided. Celeste was jealous of whoever David was seeing, right? And the reason that he allegedly killed her was because she was going to expose everything. And the text you have here, this is from March 2025. So this is roughly a month, maybe 2 months before she passes away. And Celeste appears to be the one trying to move on post-breakup. She says she is okay with staying friends, but she doesn't want to be connected online. She isn't interested in continuing to have sex with him. And the quote from that text is "without a label," which sounds way more of a casual, kind of level-headed approach to their situation as to what maybe we thought ahead of time.
Everything that I heard and saw today in court relating to this digital evidence flipped what I thought I knew about the nature of their relationship. It does not seem to me like Celeste was the one pushing for more. She's actually the one who seems a little bit more casual, a little bit more hesitant in these messages. To me, David is the one who is aggressively pursuing more time together, living together, going on trips together. He's the one who's initiating a lot of this. And you just can't get past her age during all of this. She is 13. She is just barely 14.
It's just awful. I mean, she's so young. I know that they started talking, I guess, back when she was 11, reportedly, which is just, it's just another element to this. As far as David, we've talked about his demeanor in the courtroom, and I know earlier today we'll talk in a moment about some of the graphic images that were shown when the deputy medical examiner was on the stand. But how did David act during this part of it? I mean, we're explaining very, very explicit images that were on his phone, very personal text messages now for the world to see. What was he doing during that part of it?
This was interesting, too. This was actually the first instance, Chris, during this preliminary hearing where it seemed to me like David was actively engaged in his own defense. Today was the first time I actually noticed him using the pen or pencil in front of him and that yellow legal notepad that I keep on peeking at, trying to see if he's taking any notes. Before today, I haven't seen him writing anything down, and I've got an eye on him at all times just to see how he's reacting to what's being said about him, his actions. Nothing before today, not a single thing written down. But today, as they were talking about the photos found on his phone and the text messages recovered from his iCloud account, I did notice him hunching over and starting to jot something down. I did notice him having whispered conversations with his attorneys. At one point, this was when, and this was really tough. This was actually what prompted the victim's mother to start crying and both of her parents to walk out of the courtroom, flanked by their attorney. But when they were describing the incredibly explicit images of David and Celeste engaged in various types of sexual activity found on David's phone, I noticed David losing his composure a little bit. the entire time that I've been watching him in court during this hearing and the status conferences before this, he has been very still, very composed, staring straight ahead, responding when spoken to, and not giving away much with his body language or his facial expressions. Today, when they were talking about the photos, when they were talking about his pics, you could see him starting to fidget. It was like he was shrinking in his seat. He looked out at one point. I could see his right leg jiggling up and down. And I'm really curious what he wrote down. Really curious what he shared with his attorneys during that exchange, because it wasn't just one photo or two that LAPD Detective Corey Farrell described on the stand. It was a series of photos, probably dozens. It got to a point where there were so many descriptions. They were so explicit. You can see in my notes, Chris, I actually stopped describing them one by one. And I just started grouping them into categories, of genitalia, the two of them engaging in sexual intercourse. The list goes on and on. That portion of testimony went on for much longer than I expected it to. We have not even gotten to cross-examination of this witness yet.
It's an interesting observation that, because for as graphic as the images have been shown on the screen, I mean, here's Celeste, and then you think of through those text messages that at one point in time, she meant a lot to him, it seems. And yet, no emotion when those graphic autopsy photos were shown. But when it becomes his personal life and it starts to become stuff about David, that seemed to kind of start, you saw some cracks in the facade, just based on how you're describing it, which is just kind of I'm not a body language expert, but just like an interesting observation about him, perhaps. Even though the defense hasn't had a chance to cross-examine this witness, this LAPD detective, about this digital evidence, they've been pretty aggressive, though. I think you would say, with some of the objections we've seen from past witnesses. Was there any of that during this? Like, how did the defense at least approach kind of the questioning and some very revealing information coming out about their client?
I was surprised by this too. There were not very many objections lodged by Blair Burke and Marilyn Bednarski during this portion of testimony today, as we were hearing about and seeing this digital evidence. And prior to today, they've had a sharp line of questioning. They've had objections. They've had active defense, active strategy in response to just about everything. The fact that they could find gaps in DNA evidence yesterday, right? I wasn't expecting them to just let this LAPD detective go on and continue describing those photos, but that's exactly what they did. And that tells me this is hard, irrefutable evidence, at least in regard to that one felony count: continual sexual abuse of a child under 14. I mean, these are printed out text messages taken straight from the cloud server, connected to their phone numbers. They are timestamps and they are explicit.
And you think about, with the digital evidence related to the iPhone and his location, and potentially they could argue, well, he didn't have the iPhone that night. He wasn't driving the Tesla at those particular locations. It's hard to argue against the pictures that apparently the LAPD has. The other key witness today, Grant Ho, deputy medical examiner, he and his team do the autopsy on Celeste Rivas Hernandez. There's been a big question about cause of death in this case. We know something horrific happened to this young woman, her body dismembered, according to police. What was the piece of information you saw come out of this? Piece of information that came out of this just related to how we know Celeste died at this point?
So there was a lot of buzz around this autopsy that was conducted last fall after the body was found, and it took about 3 months for them to actually release their final findings. And we learned today that's because they had to do some ancillary testing. Essentially, this deputy medical examiner, he was one of 2 people involved in doing the autopsy. They wanted to wait for toxicology testing to come back to confirm that she didn't die from an overdose. They wanted to know that before releasing this report and finalizing their finding that it was, in fact, penetrating injuries, multiple penetrating injuries that killed her. So, Dr. Grant Ho, the LA County Deputy Medical Examiner, spent quite a bit of time today describing the injuries he found, describing how the penetrating wounds to the overlying skin are associated with internal damage found inside. That includes damage to the victim's liver. He described how he used his own fingers to palpate her ribs, how he found damage or disruptions to that underlying bone, how that sits right beneath a second penetrating wound that he found on her left flank. So he painted a very clear picture of what happened to this 14-year-old. Now, here's what the defense did with that. It was Marilyn Bednarski leading cross-examination of Dr. Grant Ho this morning. She made it very clear. You may have these findings. You may have this autopsy report. You may have these shocking visuals, but you don't actually know for sure what kind of sharp instrument was used. You don't actually know for sure which penetrating wound occurred first. You don't know for sure if they happened seconds apart. And then defense actually insinuated today during cross-examination of this witness that they don't know for sure if the victim herself may have been holding the knife that stabbed her. There were a couple looks exchanged in the courtroom after Bednarski said that. And after the witness did in fact confirm that no, he does not know due to the advanced state of decomposition of the victim's remains. But everybody looked around, and I think that bordered on absurd to a couple of the people in the courtroom I spoke with during the lunch break. But that's how defense is handling this. These are sharp defense attorneys. They are aggressively doing their job. And I'm so curious to see how they attack this digital evidence from David and Celeste's iPhones when we pick this back up on Monday morning.
Without a doubt, yeah. I mean, this continuing on to Monday, I have no idea. I would never try to say that I know how this is going to go one way or another, but you do think to this point, it would be such a shock if the judge was to say that this didn't reach the bar where this could continue on, because this preliminary hearing, it's not about innocent or guilt. It's about, is there enough evidence to at least take this thing to trial? With the deputy medical examiner, and he was someone, I mean, through these questions is just kind of looking at the notes and the different theories that the defense was coming up with during that. How did Grant Ho come off as someone who would play a key role in a trial? Under cross-examination, I'm sure he's incredibly experienced. How did he handle some of those questions and theories that the defense brought forward?
Dr. Grant Ho handled cross-examination today like somebody who's been through this before. So he told us about his background, his experience, his training. He's done about 2,500 autopsies. Defense, obviously, tried to find gaps in that. They pointed out that he was a fellow at the time this autopsy was conducted. That's why he had a trainee assisting him, because fellows technically can't be trusted to have the experience to do something like this on their own. Defense then questioned how many cases he's done involving decomposition. They then questioned how many of those decomposition cases involved dismemberment. So again, they're just aggressively doing their jobs and trying to find holes in not only the evidence or the way evidence was collected, but also the credibility of witnesses testifying about what all that evidence means. In the case of Dr. Grant Ho, yes, he was a fellow. Yes, he did work with a trainee. They did this autopsy together. Yes, he says he has not done many dismemberment and decomposition cases, but the way he handled himself on the stand under cross, I felt like he's going to be just fine during trial if this goes to trial. And that's because he was very careful to qualify and explain every single thing he said. Let me give you one example. This generated quite a bit of buzz after it came out during his testimony. He says after palpating the victim's left ribs and noting an area of disruption or damage that he didn't see anywhere else underneath one of those penetrating wounds, the one on her upper chest, the one that caused damage to her diaphragm. He said, this could have been caused by perhaps a gunshot wound. So that raised a couple eyebrows. We haven't heard that previously. I think the general assumption or understanding is that this victim was stabbed and she bled out. That's what prosecutors have been alleging. That's what was in the initial charging documents. So Grant Ho actually revisited that point later, and he made sure to tell the court on record that he said that because he wanted to make the point that it could have been anything. He is not actually insinuating or speculating that Celeste was shot and stabbed. So he's very careful with his language. He's very careful to say things like potentially or possibly when that's what he means.
And as far as here we are, it's on Friday. We weren't sure if this was going to continue on into next week, but court is going to begin 9:15 in the morning Pacific time on Monday. Any expectation about what's going to happen Monday and how long this could go for?
I thought they were going to call another witness. It sounds like LAPD Detective Corey Farrell might actually be the final witness for the prosecution. So they now hand this witness off to defense to cross-examine. When they're done doing their cross-examination, there may be redirect from the prosecution. There may be some recross. After that, I don't know yet. I can't tell you how defense attorneys are going to handle this evidence from the phones. I don't know what they're going to do with these very graphic photos and these very explicit text messages. I can tell you this, though. They don't say anything just yet about the actual killing of Celeste. They only speak to the nature of the relationship between the victim and the defendant before she died.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point as we think about the heavy charge that he's facing. I mean, certainly the charge of sexual abuse of a child, that is an incredibly serious charge. But when you're talking about the murder charge, what does that digital evidence show? Potentially we'll learn something new on Monday. Julia Dang, reporter with NBC LA. Great to have you working for us here on Law and Crime. Thank you for being in the courtroom, and we'll see you next week. We will continue to follow David's preliminary hearing as it continues here on Law and Crime. You can also check out the Law and Crime Plus app. We have documents there. We have our previous episodes. You can also find our previous content right here on YouTube to get up to speed on everything in this high-profile case. That will do it for this episode of On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we are also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.